screen, do I?
I do, yes. Yes, you do.
Okay. Excellent. Well, thanks very much. And thanks for inviting me to talk this evening for me. Hello, everybody who's out there, wherever you are. Hope you're looking forward to this, and I hope that it's going to be useful in some way. So let's get started. So just a quick introduction. My name is James McGillivray. I'm a BI architect from Johannesburg, South Africa. I've just recently started my own company called Bi-Accurate. So I do independent consulting, but I also still work for another consulting company, Dariel, half of the time. I've got a couple of Microsoft certifications, business intelligence certifications specifically. And then when I'm not working, which is less often than I wish, but I enjoy playing cricket, I do some drama and some theatre and stuff like that, and I play lots of board games. And one of the reasons that I've sort of put board games here is that a lot of the demos that I'm going to be showing tonight are actually related to some board game data from boardgamegeek.com. So we'll be exploring that and playing around with that just now. All my contact details are here at the bottom, but you'll also get them at the end if anyone wants to get in touch. Feel free to shout, contact me if you have any questions, but we'll also be taking questions towards the end of the session if there's some time, and we'll go from there. Cool. So what are we going to do in this session? Well, we're going to explore a couple of different scenarios that you may come across in your work. But before we do that, we're going to just have a very quick run through the context, filter context fundamentals in DAX, because everything that we're doing today relies on filter context and the understanding of that. Once we've got that down, we're going to work on some interesting problems like the range-on-range slicer. We're going to look at role-playing relationships and maybe something that you wouldn't have thought about role-playing relationships and how to use them. Then we're going to look at bi-directional relationships, which is the bane of many people's existence in terms of their modeling. And then we're going to look at some non-numeric measures and other ways in which you can present data other than with lots of numbers and charts and graphs in that way. And then finally, hopefully we'll have some time for questions. Cool. So let's get started with some filter context fundamentals. Okay. So filter context is essentially talking about what set of data we're looking at whenever we apply a calculation. I'm sure you understand the difference between, say, a normal Excel sheet where you're not using Power Pivot, just using Excel formulas, and DAX, is that when you're working in Excel, you actually have to specify the exact cells that you're performing your function over, whereas in DAX, you just write in a calculation, and the range of cells or the range of columns or rows or whatever it is that you're doing actually is determined by the context in which you calculate that formula. Okay, so just as a little visual example, I've got this little screen here, and you can see that in my data set, as it were, I have a number of little playing pawns. Okay, I think there are 10 in total, if I remember correctly, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Well, you can sort of only just see the top orange one. Now, filter context can be applied in many ways. So it can be applied from outside a visual. So for instance, if I were to have a slicer on this imaginary report of mine, which said, I only want to see things below that white line, it would cut down my data set like that, and it would filter down. And then when I performed a count of the number of playing pieces, I would filter down to 8. Okay, that's fairly clear and understandable. That's what slicers do on the whole. But the other time that filter context becomes important is within a single visual. So if I now built a little bar chart of the color distribution of my playing pieces in this visual, it would apply filter context as follows. When I'm looking at the blue, it will only count the blue, when et cetera, as I go to the green, the yellow, and then the red. So filter context, it's all of those calculations are using the same formula or the same in DAX, but the filter context means that they come back to the different result. Cool. So I'm sure everyone was very clear on that before I started, but I just thought I'd put it out there. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at a couple of more complicated ways to change the filter context, because really when we do modeling, if everything just uses our default filter context, everything is pretty easy. It's only when you have to try and manipulate it in some way or form that it becomes more difficult. So that's the kind of things, that's the kind of problems we're going to look through tonight. Okay, so we're going to start by looking at some ranged slices. Okay, so as it says there, sort of in the heading, dealing with from and to type values. So what does that mean? Well, sometimes in our data set, we don't have a single point to join our relationship to. So let's say you're looking at a staff, an employment database, or a time of when people were working, or you're looking at when a certain thing was valid and you have a start and an end date. Okay, how do you can't create a relationship that joins those two columns and calculates a between. There's no easy way to do that, but there is a way to do that. So that's the first thing we're going to look at tonight, is how to solve that problem. So let's go through this little thing. So sometimes our data is stored as a range rather than a single value that has a direct relationship to a filter or slicer. So when would we use this? Just some examples. Maybe employee start and end dates, or minimum and maximum values. If you have some sort of data set that has a minimum and maximum value, or an applicable range as such. So how do we use this? Well, actually, there's no magic formula as such. There's a filter that we have to write, a magic filter. We're going to have to write it all ourselves. So I think it's quite difficult to try and explain. Let's actually look at a demo and actually do it. So let's start here. So here you can see I've got some data. I've got a series of board games. There's a whole bunch of board games here that I got from BoardGameGeek.com. I got the ratings of those board games, and I've got how many players it's worth. So again, this game can be played only by 2 players. Obviously, this game is between 4 and 6, 2 and 6, etc., etc., etc. So here we have a data set, and we've got a strange little problem, because we're saying, hey, tonight I'm going to have 3 people at my board game night. So I only want to see games that are applicable for 3 people. So let's say I took my slicer across there, nothing happened. Why did nothing happen? Well, if you look at my data model, I have a data model here, and I have this number of players slicer or what if parameter over here. And in fact, there is no relationship to anything going on in the rest of my model. So clearly nothing's going to happen when I actually play with that slicer, unless I actually make it do that with some DAX. Okay, so you can see, as I said, as I play around with this number, it's not changing my data set at all. Even though it wants to refresh, it's not doing anything. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, the first thing we do is we just have a look at this. So let's say what I want to do is, just for the scenario, what I want to do is I want to calculate an average rating, but I only want to calculate it for games that fall into my parameter. So where 3 is either greater than or equal to the smallest number of players, and either less than or equal to the top number of players. And conveniently, the way I sort of just explained that is exactly how we're going to write that. So I created a measure before we started, just so that I didn't have to go through all of this with you. So I have a little measure living somewhere, I suspect it's over there, called number of games. And all it does is it just does a distinct count of the game IDs, because I have multiple copies of the same game in my data set, because I rate them over time. So you've got all of that. That's not really important. What it does here is it counts the distinct number of game IDs, and that creates that gives me a number of games. So what I'm going to do is, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change this measure up here to make it into a filtered number of games, and then we're going to create an average rating that does the same thing. Okay, so we start there on our number of games. And how do we manipulate this context now so that we only bring back the records we're interested in? Well, the first thing we have to add in is we have to add in the calculate function. Just like pretty much anything we do in DAX when we want to manipulate filter context, we have to calculate it. And then we have to create our own filter. We can't use a specific filter as given by the slices or the data set. So here I have to say, okay, so I'm going to create my own filter. I'm going to choose which table I'm filtering, and in this case, it's the combined filter, combined table, which is my main, it's like my fact table basically. Okay, and then I'm going to write my condition. And my condition in this place is that combined min players, or whatever it's called, combined min players is less than or equal to the maximum of my slicer. And my slicer is called number of players. So it's in fact that I'm looking for. And then I also need to add in another thing that says combined max players is greater than or equal to the smallest value represented in my slicer. Okay, that's all it is to it. Nothing particularly complicated going on there. So we're just going to have to close out a couple of brackets there. I think it's like that. Sorts all of that out. And then I'm going to change my measure. And hopefully when it goes away, it'll, oh, something went wrong. What went wrong? Sorry, I have no idea what I've done wrong here. Pretty convinced that's exactly right. Oh, sorry, that should be number of players, like that. Okay, sorry about that, just typed the wrong thing in there. So I actually needed to get, I needed to use a measure rather than a defined field. So here we go. So here's our slicer. It has, you can see that that number changed. It was 4955, I think, or 5945, something like that. But you can see that as I play around here, that number is now going to be changed by my slicer and the value that I've put in there. Now, I haven't changed anything in my model. There's still no direct relationship here. But because I've written this DAX formula that actually allows me to manipulate that measure, it is taking that filter value into that slicer value, sorry, into account. Okay, so quickly going to do exactly the same thing, and just for the sake of speed, I'm going to copy that formula now that it works, and I'm going to create a new measure on my table. I'm going to paste that, and I'm just going to call this average rating filtered, and I'm going to change, the only thing I have to change to make this one work is I have to put in the average rating as my measure in my calculate. Okay, I've created my new measure. I'm now going to drop it into that table over there, and you should see that what happens is firstly that Power BI thinks that I have created a currency thing. So let's quickly fix that up and make it into just a normal, into a general number. Still thinks it's currency for some reason. Not quite sure why that is. Anyway, ignore that. Oh, there we go. That's better. So you can see now that I've filtered to 5 players in my slicer, and this game here, and then we held hands, is between 2 and 2 players, and therefore it doesn't have a value in this. So why is it still showing in my table? Well, I've still got my old average rating measure in there. So now, if I want to just make sure that I only see games in my table that fulfill the criteria, all I have to do is take out that other average rating, and now you can see that I only have games listed here that are applicable for 5 players. And you can squiz down the list and you can actually see that it's doing what we expect it to do, and that's quite nice. You can then interact with the visuals in any way you want, and it'll still work. So if you want to see what is the best game for 5 players, you can sort by your average rating and you can get a list. So everything there, the measure works really nicely to sort of help us make a decision on what to play in our board game night when we have 5 people who rock up. So that's the first problem we're going to deal with tonight. Nice and sort of gentle introduction into the session. Okay, let's move on. Cool. So the second thing we're going to talk about today is role-playing dimensions or role-playing relationships, because I don't necessarily want to deal with role-playing dimensions in the way that they're traditionally demonstrated. The one that everyone sort of sees most often is the old order date and ship date example when used to your date table or date dimension. It's a perfectly good example, but sometimes I feel like you can lose the context of what's actually going on when you look at it in that way. So I'm going to show a very different type of example where you have role-playing dimensions, role-playing relationships. Okay, so what is the key concept here? Well, we're going to be changing the filter context by having multiple relationships, some of them active and some of them inactive, to a single column in our data set. When can we use it? Okay, well, obviously we can use it in actual role-playing dimensions. Alternatively, we can use it in a comparison tool, and that's actually what I'm going to demonstrate for you tonight. So I will do that now. How do we use it? Well, this one's a lot easier. We don't have to write anything fancy. We don't have to create our own filters or anything. We're just going to change the filter context by using a built-in DAX measure called use relationship, or formula, should I say, function, should I say, called use relationship. And enough talking, let's go into the demo. Okay, so back to our board games. Let me just find the right role playing. Okay, so what have I got here? Okay, well let me first go out of this and go to my model, show you what the model looks like, and then I'll explain what you're going to do. Okay, so maybe I should go to the old view where Power BI doesn't change the way it looks. That's better. Okay, so you can see I have one active relationship of a table called games, which just has a game ID and a title, and that links to my main data set down here. Okay, it's an active relationship. You can see that over there by the solid line. Okay, but then I have 2 copies, additional copies of that table. Okay, they're called left and right. They literally are exact copies of that table. They're duplicates in the Power Query. I just duplicated the query. And here in each of those, I have a inactive relationship. Okay, so these ones are now not by default. They don't do anything. Okay, oops, sorry, wrong place. By default, they do absolutely nothing when I actually play with them. Let's just demonstrate that. If I go to left and I bring in title and put it here as a slicer, I go to right, I bring it in here and I put it there as a slicer as well quickly, and I put in I put a measure just in a card there somewhere where you can see what's going on. Let's just have number of games and make it into a card, and have average rating and put it into a card as well. I can choose anything I want in this data set. I can choose one value, I can choose multiple values. It's not affecting that measure at all because the relationship is inactive. So there is nothing going on there. However, it's actually really, really easy to make this work and to make it apply to what we do by writing different relationships. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come over here to games left, and I'm going to write a new measure quickly. Okay, and when my computer decides to speed up. That's nice. Cool. So let's say number of games, left slicer. And here we're going to write something really pretty simple. It's going to say calculate. What are we going to calculate? We're going to calculate number of games. And what are we going to do to manipulate the filter context here? We are going to say use relationship. And now use relationship is pretty simple. You've got to define the columns that are involved in the relationship, and it has to be defined in your model and made inactive. So in this case, what I want is I want combined game ID to link to left game ID, just like that. Okay, and I'm going to go enter, calculate. Hopefully that looks good. And now I'm going to take that measure, which is called number of games left slicer. I'm going to put it on there as well, and I'm going to make it into a card. And hopefully now when I start playing around, let me just confirm that this is left. That is right, you see. So there's the left slicer. And when I play around with this, you can now see that my measure actually takes cognizance of what it is that I'm selecting in that slicer. The other measures are still not affected. These ones in the middle, they aren't changing. But my newly defined measure, that's changing. And that's a fairly useful thing to do. I like to do this with, I like to use this to show people if they have to compare two products against each other. Specifically, let's go here. So here we've got a little example where I've actually done a few of these things. So I've basically split up my data set into left and right. Okay, I've got a couple of things going on here. Not everything on this page is going to work quite yet because some of the concepts we haven't got to yet, and I will go back to them at the end. But let's just show how this concept works. So I'm going to add a couple of board games to this slicer. So let's look for Seven Wonders Duel. Let's look for Arcana. Usually when I give this presentation in person, I ask the audience and I try and compete left and right side of the audience against each other, but it's a bit hard with me not being able to see where you are. So I'm just going to choose a couple of my favorite games here. I love this game, ARG, because of its name. I've never played it, I've never seen it, but I just think it's a cool name. And then on the right-hand side, I'm going to pick a couple of other games, and I'm going to play around with them. So let's say Catan. Come on. Oy. And Caverna. Cool. I've just got a couple of games here that I've put in here, and you can see that what's happening here is that I've got a number of games on either side that's being selected. That one's just taking its sweet time to update. I've got average ratings split by only the games that I've actually chosen. I've got how many designers are involved. I've got which rankings they are in terms of who's got the highest ranking on the board game list, all that kind of thing. So here I've got a really cool little dashboard that people can look at. They can make their own decisions. They can really compare their things to each other. And yeah, it's a nice little tool to have for your business users if they want to compare either products against each other or stores or something else that they may want to compare metrics. And it's a little bit more difficult to do it if you don't define it in this way and actually just give them hey, here's a comparison screen. So there. So yeah, that's the sort of, I think it's quite a cool use case for role-playing relationships. And it's also, for me, it's easier and clearer to see what's going on in that scenario than if you were to look at the just like one relationship to multiple columns on a fact table. Cool. So let's move on to the next segment. I'm going to talk about bidirectional relationship here. And this is an interesting one because bidirectional relationships can create unexpected behaviors if you don't use them with caution. And they also can have a severe impact on performance of your model. So by default, it's sort of been suggested by many people who know a lot about DAX that having bidirectional relationships in your model is not necessarily the best modeling practice. And but sometimes you still need them. Sometimes you have to make them work. So we're going to look at a way to do that through DAX rather than through making your relationship, making the model have the bidirectional relationships. Cool. So why would we use these? Well, sometimes you want to be able to drill from your fact to your dimension and not vice versa. It's kind of a counterintuitive thing to think about, but sometimes it's what happens. Let's say, for example, I choose on my one dimension table, I have a category, a product, and then a category, okay? And on my, when I filter my fact table by maybe a date, I want to see how many different categories, product categories were sold. Now, if you think about the logical flow of how that actually happens, you would actually have to flow your normal relationship would go from your date table to your fact, to your date dimension to your fact table, and would filter down to a subset of rows. But once you then need to apply that back up to your other dimension, then you need something going from the fact to the dimension and not the way that you normally filter data. So that's exactly the kind of scenario when you need to use it. So how do we use that during DAX? Well, it's pretty simple as well. We just use the cross-filter formula, and you'll see that it follows a very similar pattern to the used relationship that we just did. So let's go straight into a demo and see. Cool. So let me just find out where bidirectional relationships. Here we go. Okay. So let me go back to my model quickly and explain to you what's going on here. One game in my data set, one game can have multiple themes, okay? So if you think about it, that kind of makes sense. A game could be history and war, or cartoons and, I don't know, fighting, or all kinds of different things. A game can have multiple themes. A game can also have multiple designers, multiple people who worked on it, who made it work in that way. And this is the kind of, and by default, I'm filtering here, and I'm saying when my games are selected, go down and apply the themes in that way. So the relationship is flowing down this diagram. Okay, so on a game, I can see how many categories it has, or which categories are linked. Okay, or alternatively, which designers are linked. But I can't start at the theme level or category level. I can't start there and go in the opposite direction and say how many games have that theme. And that's the problem we're going to try and solve now. Okay, so, and you can see what I mean by that problem. If I look at this number here, this number of games by category, if I just use the normal number of games thing and the direction of the relationship was right, it would, this graph would make more sense. You'd actually see what we were expecting to see here with an actual bar chart, okay? So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to actually make that, we're going to have to fix that. So if I look at this thing, you can see that the number of games by category measure at the moment is just saying number of games. And now I'm going to modify it to make it work. Okay. Function, we're going to calculate, and all we have to do here is we have to say cross filter, okay? And again, here we have to specify the left and right column names. So exactly the way we would do it before. So I've just got to remember what they are in this case. So theme index, and the other one is called combined index. Okay, so there I've specified now the two columns involved in the relationship. Okay, there is an existing relationship between those columns at the moment, but it only works from the combined table down to the themes table. What I wanted to work is, and this is the last argument to my method or my function, is that I wanted to work in both directions. Okay, so I'm going to add that in. I'm going to put in another, close the brackets over there. And as I change that, woohoo, we've got a graph that actually makes much more sense. So what is the most popular category of games? Well, card games. So 1,519 of the games in my data set are actually card games. There we've got a nice solved thing. What that means from a performance point of view is that I'm not keeping that relationship in every calculation. So if I do normal calculations, if I do anything else that's going on, I'm not keeping that that relationship, that bidirectional relationship active. I only have a bidirectional relationship in this specific measure that I've defined. So therefore, the only time that it'll have to add that complexity and overhead to the model is when I'm actually calculating that specific measure. So that's a nice way for us to keep the model as performant as possible, but without losing any functionality. So there we've solved our bidirectional relationships problem. It's something that sort of doesn't come along that often, but occasionally it's good to know that you can solve it and you don't have to worry about adding into your model and potentially having a performance hit just to make it work. Okay, so that's the 3 out of 4 done. And the last thing I'm going to talk about in this session is non-numeric measures. So non-numeric measures is something I quite like because it's almost like a different way to think about your data. By default, when we think of measures, we think of sum, we think of average, we think of divide x by y to create a ratio. We think of all of these things, but all of them bring back numbers. They always bring back numbers. But sometimes you want more than the number. You want some sort of context. You want a text field that gives you context. You want potentially an image. You want a URL. There's a lot of different ways you can create measures to do different things by actually working with them. And it's not particularly fancy. You probably have done this once or twice before in your work, but it's nice to sort of touch on it and go through it. Okay. So sometimes numbers are not enough. There are lots of scenarios where adding something other than a number can give you more context and can give you something really cool to add to your dashboard, something that gives users a lot of value. Okay, so we've got a couple of different ways that we actually do this. We've got a lot of it is string manipulation. There's different things, playing with different, changing the blank filters and using concatenate X. So I'm actually going to show in this one a couple of examples rather than just a single example. So let's go over here and let's start by taking the work that's already done off these tables, and then we'll actually make it work. So let's just get rid of those two. Okay. So what I've got here is I've basically just got a table of all the different combinations of the minimum and maximum number of players on a game. Okay, well, it's not all. I've got a sort of a subset set up here. So these are all the player combinations. You could have 1 player, 1 to 2, 2, 1 to 3, 2 to 3, etc., just like that. Okay. Now our normal measures work perfectly like this. So you could say, show me what is the where's our normal thing? How many games are there in each category here? Okay, that gives us a count of. So what's popular? Well, 2 to 4 player games are one of the more popular. 2 to 5, so, you know, or just 2-player games. It's a lot of, okay, but that's a number. That's fine. You could also just have your normal average ranking. So here we've got some numerical measures, just like we expected, and how we usually use them. But now, what if we want to do something different? So what if we want to say, show me the actual range of players in a measure? Okay, so maybe I want to look at this over, maybe I want to look at this. So let's write a measure that actually creates a range of players. Okay, it's not going to be very difficult. So we're gonna call it. Sorry, I just have to call it 2 because I already have a measure called player range. So I'm going to call it player range. And how that's going to work is we're basically going to say var no. So basically just creating a little variable there, which is the minimum number of players. Okay, then I'm going to do the same for maximum number of players. And we're going to do it like that. Maybe this doesn't make sense because we've already got, let's rather say how long the game takes to play, because we've already got the players on a dimension, so it'll be a bit strange. Okay, so we're going to then just say return to me and now this is where at the moment everything I've done basically is dealing with numbers. So I've just got a minimum and a maximum, but now I'm going to make this into a string, and I want to say I'm going to say here return to me between okay. So here I've got a little, I've got a thing that basically shows me how long this game takes, these games take. Okay, so it's going to show me for all of the one-player games, when this thing goes away, for all of the one-player games, how long, what is the minimum amount of time, what is the maximum amount of time they take to play. So here I've got a little measure that says to me between 0 and 3,000 minutes. I think some of this data from Board Game Geek is probably not accurate. I feel like people who are playing 3,600-minute games, that's a good chunk of time. Anyway, so here we've got a little thing that tells us, and you can see it's nice, it works, it takes context here in this bottom, in the bottom of my in my total row, it actually calculates the total number, and it actually gets the minimum and maximum across the entire data set. So here we've got a cool little measure that just, you know, you may want to put it in a corner of a dashboard when you want to demonstrate someone's running times, or anything where you want a little bit more than just 2 numbers. Okay, so but that's a really, really simple measure, basically just to give you an idea of what's going on there. Okay, then let's just say let's say now I'm looking at these games and I want to say, what is the best game for, if you're looking at this range of 1-player games, what is the best game for 1 to 2 players? What is the best game for 2 players, etc., etc. So here, now we're going to write a new measure, and now we're starting to get a little bit more complicated. Okay, so this measure, and I'm going to have to try and go through this a bit slowly because it requires a little bit of sort of understanding of what's going on. But this measure will actually bring back the name of the best game in the category, in the category that we're actually looking at. Okay, so we're going to start by I'm going to try to write this from the outside in, from the inside out, so that it makes a more sense. Okay, so let's call it top-rated game a filter. Okay, so basically it's going to take my filter context and it's going to work out what is the top rated game based on that context. Okay, and the first thing I have to do here is I have to say, where I lost it. I have to get a list, a distinct list of all of the game names. Okay, so I want games title. Okay, that's going to give me a distinct list of all of the titles. Then for that list, I need to find the top one, which is the top one. So then we use the top n function. Okay, in this case, our n value that we're interested in is 1. Okay, the table that we're interested in is that values table there. Okay, then we need to order by expression. So our order by expression here is a measure, and it's actually the average rating. What is the average rating of games? Because we want to see the best one, and then we want to order that descending. Okay, now if I put this on if I write it just like that, it may or may not work. Why do I say that? Well, the top n function in DAX actually returns a table. Okay, and in this case, our table only has 1 column, and it should only have 1 value. But if you had multiple games that had exactly the same rating, the top n doesn't differentiate between ties. It actually returns all of them. So you may bring back multiple records at once. And that, of course, would cause our measures to fail. So what we actually have to do is we have to wrap that in something to make sure that it doesn't fail. So we're going to concatenate. Okay, now we've got our table for our concatenation, which is that one there that we've got there. What is the expression that we want in? We want the title, because that's what I want to show. So we want that. We want to delimit it by a comma. If we get ties, we want a comma in between the names. And we want to order by alphabetically, so by game title and ascending. And hopefully, if I've done everything right, that shouldn't break. Okay, DAX didn't complain, so that's a good start. And now if I put that onto my table, it actually tells me. That's really cool. It actually tells me for a 1-player game, the best game is target for today. Okay, that's what our measure said. I want you to remember that, target for today. And we're going to look at just one other example, and that's here, 2 to 4-player game is Joan of Arc. Okay, so let's quickly just go and do a sanity check on that. So let's take minimum players here and put it down as a, we're going to put it into as a slicer quickly. There's a slicer. We're going to put this one maximum players as a slicer. Whoops, that's the wrong measure, James. Max players rather than max. Okay, also not the right one. Third time lucky. Okay, and all we want over here then is we want the game names, and we want the average rating, and we want to order by average rating, and then we will see what happens. So the first example that we saw here is a 1-player game only. So if I just change this slicer to be a 1-player game only, and we order by the top, we actually see target for today, which was, if you remember, the top one according to our measure. Cool, so that's really nice. So let's then look at a different measure, and let's say minimum players 2, maximum players 4. And if we sort in descending order, again, we get the Time of Legends Joan of Arc. That's really cool. Okay, so now we've got this measure here, target for today, and Joan of Arc as we expected. So we know it's working, it's doing what we expected it to do. And I'm sure if you think about it, you can think that there's some really nice applications for this in a business sense, because sometimes knowing what the top number was is not necessarily as important as knowing what the who got that number. The example I always give here is, if you're talking about the golden boot in a football league or the top scorer or something like that, okay, they never show how many goals the top scorer has scored without giving you the context. They'll always say the top scorer is whoever, Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang, and then they may say he scored 15 goals. So if we wanted to do that, we could of course write a quick measure that said highest rated game and put the measure in there. Then you'd have both pieces of information. But what's really useful here is giving it context. What is the best game? If you've only got one player, what is the best game for you to play? It's that one. Really nice, quick way to make a decision. Okay, so I'm going to quickly take that player range off because I want to show you some of the other things you can do with non-numeric measures. Let's combine something we did earlier with the non-numeric measure. So I'm going to bring in my a slicer here for number of players. So it should bring you, okay, cool. So I've got my number of players. Now, if you remember correctly, what we did earlier was we wrote the filter context that allowed us to get the average rating and the number of games for a specific number of players. Okay, so let's take some of this stuff off. Oh, my slices overhanging the whole world. So let's get rid of maybe some of these things. And let's say, we created that player range, which was the time of the game. So between 0 and 22,500 minutes. Those are our game ranges here, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add in, I just want to add in a new, I want to add some games in here because I want to see some stuff. Okay, so now we've got this game. Let's take this top rated game off because it doesn't really make sense. So now we've got the games, how many games there were, average rating, and the range. Now, as you can see, when I go to a certain value here, I've got some things not showing. Now, why is that? I'm not entirely sure because I haven't put in a filter. That doesn't make sense. Don't you hate it when demos don't do what you expect them to do? Okay, let's take some things off here and let's go back to basics. So I'm just going to put. Okay, so I've just got my list of games here. I want the average. I just want the average rating for those games. So let's get here and go average rating. Put it back on there. Now all of these should have an average rating. Cool. Okay. If I now put the average rating by the filter, the one we wrote earlier, this filtered average rating, okay, if we put that on there, you'll see that that now takes this context into account, which is what we tested earlier and played around with. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in my, I'm going to create a new measure, and I'm going to put it on this number of players table, and I'm going to call it. Come on. Time range, but I only want to, I want to filter it. Okay. So we're gonna copy that measure that we had earlier and put it in there. So we're going to go like that, and this is going to be called. This is that measure we created, player range 2. Okay, and that's going to show us. Technically, that should show us a list of the times for these games, but they should be filtered. So we should only see them on the same rows where we have this average rating filtered. We should have a time range filtered. Okay, but now we have this horrible situation here, between and of minutes. What's happening there is that in my measure, it's doing what I told it to do, except that the minimum and maximums that I defined don't exist. So if you remember what that measure looked like, where is it? Play range 2, this one. We had a var min number, var max number. Now, because because of the context in which we're now running this thing, where that we're filtering down to records where they are greater than or less than that number, you now have a case where that record is actually not present in my data set. So now we have to look at making it a little bit more, robust. So let's have a look here. And all we're going to do here, actually, and this is really quite easy, is we're going to say if is blank min number. Oh, we need a and. So we need an if and is blank min number, comma is blank max number. So if it's blank, what do? Well, actually we return blank. So that saves us. Otherwise, we return that little definition of ours, and now we write it like this. And hopefully, now because we fixed that little issue, when I come here, we should no longer have a name, that time definition where we don't have, where it's actually not selected. So now if I were to take the actual average rating for all games off, you can see now that my actual data set gets filtered down again in the visual because all my measures are blank. So it's quite nice. We can combine these various techniques that we've looked at tonight. You can actually combine 3 or 4 of them together, or 2, 3 might be a bit hectic, but you know, you can do the best game for the left and the right, like I showed you earlier, and you may, if you noticed, you may actually have seen that it was there. So when I selected my various games here, that top one, that 7 Wonders Duel is the top rated of the 3 I selected there, and Caverna is the top rated of the 2 I selected there. So there I'm using both the user relationship and my non-numeric measure. Here you can see I've actually, something I sort of didn't go over is, if instead of returning the name of the game, I returned an image, I can actually bring back a picture of the best performing game in my scenario, the ones I've highlighted, and you can see how that's working over there. So we've got the situation where you can actually use multiple of these things all together, okay? And just the last one, just as an example, let's have a look at what is used on that measure there. So here in this measure, you can see what I've done is I've actually done a filtered average rating. So it's taking my slicer into account, and then I'm using the relationship. So here I've got multiple things going on in this world. I've got, as you can see down here, here's the bi-directional ones that we talked about. And you can combine all of those things, and you can actually create really cool, really useful business solutions by understanding how the models work. Okay, so I think that's about all I've done. I'm going to hop over onto webinar now and see if we've got some questions. Anything that...
James? Yep, I got some questions for you. Okay, the first one comes from Constantine. He'd like to know is, can you use the use relationships function in combination with the security formulas? I imagine that's the username, and to basically apply, you know, sort of, I guess, dynamic security within analysis services.
Just trying to think. I'm trying to understand the scenario. Sorry.
So I should imagine using. I guess using that, the username function that you can return, and then using that in some sort of dynamic.
Can't see why it wouldn't work. I've never technically tested it out or anything like that, but I can't see any reason why it wouldn't work. although I'm trying, sorry, when I said I was trying to understand the scenario, I was trying to work out why you wouldn't have a direct relationship. But I don't know of any restriction that would stop it from working. So I think the answer is probably yes.
Well, thanks, Constantine. I hope that sort of gave you an answer. Otherwise, let us know. The next question comes from Andreas, who would like to know, you showed us the top, like the top game. Would it be possible to do a list? So like a list of top 10?
Yes, you can. So that top N function that I did, actually, you can choose how many records to bring back. And then you could, would you like to, I assume what the question is, can you make the top 10 into a measure? You can. Yeah. We can quickly go back and actually play around with that and see it work. So let's just go to a blank page here. And so what we had here was we had just got to remember which measure it was that I was playing around with. I think it's here. Well, here, I obviously did this for someone else in a different question. So here, we're going to take the top 10 games by average rating and concatenate them, put them into a measure. And if we put them on a card there, you can see there's my top 10. You could, you wouldn't be able to put actual numbers in between them, but you could put in a, if I can remember what it is, Unichart 13 and Unichart 10, I think it's like that, if I'm lucky. There we go. So you can put them on different lines. So yeah, you can absolutely do that. You can use that function to do that. And it could be useful where you want to see your top 3, your top 5, whatever it is, bottom. If you do top N and you want to see the bottom, you just have to change this order over here to to ascending, sorry. I'll start at the bottom and go up, obviously. So yeah, you can absolutely do that.
Great. And final question from Brett is just, will copies or examples of this code be made available after the talk?
I can make copies available. I wanted to write a blog post with everything in it, and I never got around to it, but I will. I will definitely publish this PBIX. I can publish the PBIX to my website, and then people can come download it.
Cool. Okay, Brett, we will be publishing the notes. You should be able to see in the handout section right now. You should be able to see the slides that James used today, advanced DAX modeling.pdf. I'll also be sending out a mail tomorrow where you can, it'll include a YouTube video of the session if you want to rewatch it, and I can include a link to James's talk in that as well. So I think that's it for today. So James, I just want to thank you for coming to speak to our members. And I want to thank you all for coming to listen. Again, a reminder, the next meeting will be on the 5th of February with Angela Henry. So with all that, please guys, remember there's a quick survey after this. If you could just fill that in, helps us to understand what kind of content you're after. All right, and that's it. Thanks, guys. Cheers.
Cheers.